right, welcome back. We are on the Dark Matter Digital Network tonight, and Shaun Attwood joins us. I don't want to give you his full bio because it is so much to try to condense in 30 seconds or 45 seconds. So we're going to spend the duration of the show getting into one of the most unbelievable stories you will hear outside of a movie. I can't believe there hasn't been a movie made about this, but there was a Locked Up Abroad episode, and that's where I saw Shaun first. Locked Up Abroad is on the National Geographic Channel, and Shaun, you know, a lot of the episodes, they're like drug mule episodes. It's somebody in Thailand, somewhere in Southeast Asia, and they try to bring drugs through an airport. They get caught. They wind up in some third world hellhole prison. Your episode, your life story, is just a little bit more complicated than that. You were actually a very high level distributor of club drugs, specifically ecstasy, and your entrance into the criminal underworld is, I want to say it's an unlikely story, but reading some of your book last night, Hard Time, and you've got 3 books out with plans for a 4th, as I understand it. Reading your book last night, I have to say that it's almost inevitable what happened. You're because we're talking about somebody who liked drugs and had nothing but time and money on his hands.
Yeah, drugs had put a cloud in my head that had scrambled my decision-making processes. So as I went further over that slippery slope, from just hooking up my friends to becoming a distributor, importing up to 40,000, 50,000 pills at a time, you know, I was thinking to myself, this is fun, this is cool. I've seen Scarface, I've seen Pulp Fiction, you're the man, you're never going to get caught, you're living in a movie. But that's because the drugs was telling me so. And then May 16th, 2002 was my wake-up call when the SWAT team smashed my door down.
And you at that point, you had been out of the business for a while, too. So that was especially shocking to you. You had no drugs in the home. You had no cash in the home. So you thought, hey, they have no physical evidence at this point. How could they possibly charge me?
Yeah, I was naive to the statute of limitations. In Arizona, if you've committed a drug crime, they can get you up to 7 years, and all it takes is for someone to say, you sold them drugs within that 7-year period, and they've got you.
What's incredible to me, though, is how law enforcement, at least in this part of Arizona, I guess, it seems like they were kind of the Keystone Cops because they had surveillance on you for a while, but they didn't even know your name until that last year.
I flew people over from England. I used various aliases, various bank accounts that weren't in my name, and I kept moving around constantly. And I also think because me and my friends were doing so much drugs, we were so disorganized that it threw the cops off, so there was no stability about our methods that they could latch onto.
Huh. Wow. The fact that it was disorganized, that's incredible because it seemed like, at least on the show and at least, based on what I read, it seems like it was a very slick operation. You were making millions upon millions with this. You were working with the New Mexican Mafia. I didn't even know there was a New Mexican Mafia, but hey, I guess you've got organized crime everywhere. Running up against Italian mob. So we have to start at the beginning. You are from a small town in the UK. You wound up in Phoenix, Arizona, of all places. Why did you come to the States, and why specifically Phoenix?
Well, I'm from a little chemical manufacturing town, and when I'd visit my aunts in Arizona as a teenager, you know, the plane would be coming into land, and I'd see all these swimming pools in the backyards. I'd get off the plane, and there was the sun, and the roads were twice as big as in the UK, and the cars seemed much bigger, and it just dazzled me. And I watched that movie, Wall Street, Greed is Good, you know, you can make all this money if you go to America, and that became my dream.
And you were already kind of a stock market whiz over in the UK. You were reading hundreds upon hundreds of these finance books. You were playing with your grandmother's money. You were doubling it, investing, right?
Yeah, I developed an unnatural interest in the stock market as a teenager, and I would credit that to my economics teacher. He took me under his wing, had me reading the Financial Times, explaining how the stock market works. So I was already following the stock market at 14, made my first investment at 16, borrowed some money off my nan, and I doubled that in BT shares, and that was it. I was just hooked then from an early age.
So you wanted to go to America, and with the help of your aunt, you set up shop basically in Phoenix.
Yeah, if you've seen The Wolf of Wall Street, I started out in a brokerage a bit like that. It was glorified telesales. That's been the office for the 6 o'clock in the morning sales meeting and cold calling all day long. And my first couple of years, I wasn't much good at it. It was commission only. I was running out of money on my student credit cards and worried I was going to have to come home. But 5 years in, I was grossing $500,000 a year, had my own staff, secretary, cold callers. I was only in my 20s and I had enough money to retire. And that's when I started to invest in the party scene.
Invest in the party scene. That's an interesting way to put it.
Well, in the beginning, I was buying all my friends drugs and I was getting a lot of attention. And from being a shy teenager, suddenly I was this party animal. And then I started to see the business potential of it. And I take full responsibility for what I did. I ran this organization that was importing all of these pills. We had crime family dinners each month. I had 200 people working for me. And, I had to pay the price in the end, and I accept my karma cheerfully.
Yeah, you got it pretty hard in the end, I guess. One of the worst prisons in America, and we'll have to get into that later on. But I mean, we're really going from A to Z here. There's a hell of a lot in between. How somebody goes from just buying some pills for their friends, or whatever club drugs for your friends, to importing thousands upon thousands of pills from Holland every month. With the time that we have, how exactly does one become this criminal kingpin? This is a Walter White story without the cancer, without the sob story. This is just a kid with too much time and too much money, and you turned into Scarface basically.
Well, it was a lot less violent, the rave scene. People are, massaging each other, cuddle puddles, and just dancing on ecstasy. But, greed did take over in my case. How it started was, I got in on the ground floor in Arizona. The police didn't pretty much know what it was. I had smugglers come in with ecstasy pills, get stopped at the airport. They would open them. They were in vitamin containers, and then they just put them back in the person's luggage. So out of my close friends developed about 10 different factions of the organization. And then each faction leader, he had about 10, 20 people working under him. And it just grew from there. And I'd have board meetings, so all the faction heads would be at the weekly board meetings, and everyone would give their input as to how we could grow the business. And it was all run really like a corporation.
Well, that's what I was saying. It really doesn't sound disorganized. You had a background in finance. You did run it like a business. When you started doing this, based on what you said on the Locked Up Abroad episode, you were terrified early on, which I think any normal person would be. When you went from just buying pills for your friends to buying larger quantities, you basically were... Did you have real, high-minded ambitions at that point of being that Scarface character? Because it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. You had to go to L.A. to a higher level distributor because the dealers in Phoenix didn't have enough for you.
Well, I was high on the lifestyle. I was addicted to the lifestyle. And as it grew, I went with the flow. You know, I started to buy 20 to 50 pills for my friends on the weekends. We had these little house parties, and then as that expanded, the local dealers, they basically said, we don't have any more to sell to you. So I found out where they were getting their pills from, and they were getting out of LA. And I started to set up relationships with dealers from LA, and I was getting anywhere from 500 to 5,000 pills a time from the LA people. That was prior to it expanding to Amsterdam.
Mm. So what was that first meeting like, that higher level distributor?
The first one I went out to in Los Angeles, because I hadn't done anything like an out-of-state transaction before, I was absolutely terrified. The guy kept us waiting. We were parked outside his house for ages. He'd gone off surfing, and then he showed back up. He had these like surfer gangster dudes coming and going from his house, and I thought we were going to get robbed. I thought the police were going to bust us, or they would pull us over on the way out. And I went in there, and he pulls out this big bag of pills, and I said, "Do you mind if I taste one? Because I'm really good at being able to taste whether it's an actual MDMA or not." So he looked at me in surprise, and he gave me one. And he said, "Do you want to drink a chaser with that?" And I said, "No, I need to chew it." So I chewed it up, and it tasted good. And we did the transaction, and we got out of there. And all the way home, you know, I was coming up on the ecstasy. I had some guys with me, but I was still worried I was going to get caught. But once we got home, and those pills just sold that weekend, that was it. Then I just had dollar signs flashing in my brain.
So, and this was happening when? Mid-90s then? Yeah,
this was about the time I was finishing up working in the stock market, which was 96, 97.
Okay. How were you able to rationalize what you were doing? You just saw those. I mean, it was the dollar signs and the drugs basically that just clouded everything, and you said, "You know what? It's worked."
Took over from my original goal was just to keep the party going. You know, as a raver in the UK, when it began here, it was like a revolution in music, and I was in my late teens. Prior to that, I wouldn't get up and dance, wouldn't go up and talk to people. I went to a club, took ecstasy, made friends with half the club, wouldn't stop dancing all night long, and that had such a big impression on me. I pledged to myself that when I made money in America, I was going to transfer that rave scene over to the Arizona, so that the American people could enjoy what I'd enjoyed. But once I then started to see the profit potential of it, after I was hooking my friends up, that's when the greed took over.
Mm. Yeah, you probably could have made a significant amount of money just throwing raves, but you know what? If you can set up a rave, make money on that, and hey, you've got all this ecstasy, you've got a built-in customer base.
Yeah, that's called vertical integration in economics. But the thing was, I didn't need to be doing it. I had so much money in the stock market. Right. I could have, I'd probably be worth about 10 million right now. I was worth 2 million in the stock market, and I lost absolutely everything because I chose to go down that road of making fast cash. And that's what I tell the school kids now. I go in and tell them my story in the hope they won't make the kind of stupid decisions I made.
Well, that's like this show Locked Up Abroad. The first half of the episode usually... well, maybe not so much if it's one of the drug mule episodes, but some of the other episodes, it shows the ascent of these people getting into the lifestyle. I mean, your episode, your life story is a perfect example. These early years of your ascent into... I guess any movie is like that too, Wolf of Wall Street, Layer Cake to some, certainly Scarface, and I guess you're just, clouded, thinking that, the money's never going to end, the party's never going to end, and the police are never going to catch on. Can you watch any of these true crime movies with and sort of divorce yourself from reality or can you, divorce yourself from your background and just sort of sit and enjoy the movie?
I've become more discerning watching these true crime movies now because I've mingled with gangsters, and if these gangsters don't match up to what I've met these days, I just can't watch the movie anymore because there's a lot of phony scripts out there.
Oh, sure.
So my background now is just maybe more discerning when it comes to those movies, but I still thoroughly enjoy them.
All right, listen, we're talking to Shaun Attwood. Shaun is a former drug kingpin who did serve hard time in one of the toughest prisons in America, and that would be Maricopa County in Arizona. We'll come back in a minute. You're listening to Dark City on the Dark Matter Digital Network. Hang on.
WABC. You're listening to Dark City on the Dark Matter Radio Network.
All right, welcome back. Shaun Attwood continues with us. When you start selling and distributing mass quantities of drugs anywhere, I imagine you're going to run up against competition. It's a market, chances are, that already exists. You had to get protection from somebody, basically, to move in. How did that work out? The New Mexican Mafia is what you talk about in the book. I didn't even know there was a New Mexican Mafia, but I guess there's organized crime everywhere, so...
Yes, the New Mexican Mafia were the most powerful, dangerous criminal organization in Arizona at that time. They tried to take out the head of the prison system. They'd killed dozens of witnesses. And, how did a nerdy business graduate from the UK end up getting the protection of them? It was completely by chance. When I was throwing the house parties earlier on in my ecstasy days, we was at a house party. And, it was in Tempe, Arizona. A lot of students from the university. People were just being really mellow. Some people were on ecstasy. Some people were smoking weed. And there was another dealer there, and he was Mexican-American, and I was just getting to know this guy. And what happened was, a Tempe police officer came in. He said he could smoke. He said he could smell the weed smoke from outside. And he said, nobody move, and he was about to call in to the police and get everybody arrested. Now, this other dealer that was there, the Mexican-American guy, G-Dog, he just pulled out a gun, pointed it at the cop, and said, the only one that's not leaving is you. Everybody else leave. So all of us just ran out of there into the night. And I went to an apartment in that complex that some of my friends were living at. And, we were discussing it, and we were nervous. We thought the police were all going to come. Next thing, a guy jumps over the back porch, knocks on the French window, and it's G-Dog. And we let him in, and he says, the police have come in, don't answer the door. They can't come in if you don't answer the door. They don't have probable cause. And, we hid him in there for a couple of hours, and the police did come. There was helicopters, there was dogs, there was everything. We didn't answer the door, and they just moved on. And after that, he said to me, basically, you and your friends protected me that night. I'm going to introduce you to my brother, and he these guys will have your back, like your friends had my back. So I went over to his brother's house, and as I walk into the house, I noticed they've got like a little TV screen. They're watching all the cars on the road. And then next to that, they've got the biggest TV that I've ever seen. But on top of the TV is a rocket-propelled grenade launcher like I'd seen in the Rambo movies. I was thinking, These guys are way heavier than anything I'm involved in. I got really nervous. I was polite. I ended up getting in business with them, but whenever I went over to that house, I got really nervous, and I never stayed around for very long. And I didn't know who they were still. And it was about 2 years later, they were all rounded up, and they were all headline news, and it was the New Mexican Mafia, and it said about, all the murder for hire they'd been doing and all this other stuff. But yeah, those guys were protecting me, and because G-Dog and those guys had my back, people knew they were hardcore, and that helped me get through a lot of things without getting anyone attacking me or trying to rob me or kill me.
Yeah, I feel like this probably would have ended much, much sooner and would have ended messier had you not had these guys behind you. At least that's my impression.
Oh, absolutely. I was putting myself in extremely dangerous situations because the drugs was telling me it was cool and it was fun. And I didn't understand properly how dangerous it was because the drugs had scrambled my brain. And, once I got into jail and sobered up and looked back at all the dangerous situations I put myself in, the first thing I said to myself was, how on earth are you still alive? Mm.
Yeah, well, you got incredibly lucky. There are so many elements to your story that it is incredible that you're alive. New Mexican Mafia, did they just call themselves that? Were they connected to Mexican cartels in any way, or was cartel activity not really, where it is today yet?
The New Mexican Mafia, or La MA, come out of the prison system in California, and it spread over to Arizona from there. Now, these are Mexican Americans. They're not actually doing things with the Mexican cartels because that's the old Mexican Mafia. In the Arizona prison system, the New Mexican Mafia and the old Mexican Mafia have been at war since the 1990s. So these are Mexicans that are descended. They're not actually born in Mexico. They're Mexican Americans, Chicanos.
Okay. The cartel activity that we've seen, I guess specifically in Juarez is like ground zero of this drug war south of the border, just south of the border. If you look at a map, you've got El Paso, and then you've got Juarez that looks like it's practically on top of it.
Yep.
The cartel activity was nowhere near where it is today. And I feel like if you were doing this in 2009 to 2010, it would have ended much, much messier.
Oh, yeah, because I had operations in Mexico. I had a beachfront condo in Puerto Penasco down there, Rocky Point. And my pills, when they were coming from Holland, they would actually get flown from somewhere like France or Germany to Mexico City. Then they'd be transported over to Hermosillo. And then from Hermosillo, we'd transport them over to Rocky Point. And then from Rocky Point, we'd take them over the U.S. border. So different smugglers would handle different parts of that route.
I can't believe that nobody ever ratted you out. I mean, there are so many, 200 employees, you're saying, and there was never any weak link that put law enforcement onto you?
Well, there was, because it was 10 witness statements that led to the investigation. But in terms of snitches, Sammy the Bull was arrested before me, and I think all 57 of his co-defendants testified against him. But in my case, I had over 100 people arrested with me, and I think there was only like 3 or 4 people agreed to cooperate with the police.
Oh, wow.
And that's because, I really took care of everybody over the years, spread the wealth around. Everybody had legal benefits, as in they would get a lawyer assigned to them or they would get bailed out of jail. So we were really a close-knit organization.
Sammy the Bull Gravano, this is probably one of the last people that you'd want to have anything to do with. I didn't even know he operated in Arizona. For some reason, I just always thought he was an East Coast guy, but this is Italian Mafia, and apparently they were really making a lot of noise. They were bringing some of the heat onto you. Is that right?
Yeah. Sammy the Bull Gravano, after he testified against Gotti, the police let him walk on almost 24 murders, and they put him in witness protection in Tempe. And then he set up this ecstasy ring. His son was part of it as well, who I met in prison. And, they were my main competition. And his son told me, that he'd actually been dispatched one night by his dad to take me out to the desert from a nightclub where I'd been spotted. The only reason they'd just missed us that night was because my best friend, Wildman, who was one of my bouncers, he got in a scuffle and we'd had to leave that place in a hurry. So again, that was another one of those dangerous situations that when I look back on, I was like, how did you get through all this alive?
Oh, I know. A friend of mine once said, and this is something that's always stuck with me, you never know who's around you. Somebody on the subway next to you could be a serial killer. You'd never know it. You might get a weird sense about somebody and you might find out. I mean, most of the time you will not find out later on what exactly was going on with that person. You bump into, I live in New York. I'm around thousands of people just walking down the street every single day. You don't know what's going on. And, the fact that for a fact that you were going to be taken out that night, I mean, that would keep me up at night for years.
Well, I'm 5,000 miles away from Arizona in the UK now.
But I mean,
all those guys have gone to Hollywood with this show Mob Wives. I've corresponded with Sammy the Bull's son, Gerard Gravano, by email, and I'm assured that there's no residual threats to my life. So I'm not so worried about that.
I mean, I'm just surprised that you seem so well adjusted, having gone through all of this, having spent time in these horrific conditions in jail, which we still have not gotten to, but we'll, of course, we are going to have to. Sammy the Bull Gravano. He was going to dispatch you. He ended up knocking out the teeth of one of your other associates. He got off.
Yeah, his goons did, basically. Yeah. Okay. When things were heating up between us, they knocked out the teeth of one of my top sales guys, robbed his pills, robbed his money. And that was when I realized I needed to leave Phoenix. And I actually moved to Tucson, moved up in the mountains in North Tucson in a street that was gated and guarded. You couldn't even get up into that area without going through, the guard and him buzzing the house and stuff like that. So I felt comparatively safer once I'd moved to Tucson. But that was the wake-up call when someone so close to me got his teeth knocked out by the guys.
But things had been relatively calm until the Italian mafia moved in. I mean, you were operating more or less with impunity. You were throwing these raves and basically without issue, right?
Yeah, the rave scene, like I mentioned, it's just people dancing. There's hardly ever any violence. The Mexican mafia, they had coke and weed and crystal meth locked down. So I knew if I went into those markets, I would be bumping heads with the most violent, drug organizations. So trying to keep it within the rave scene, that was aiming for safety as well.
Now, here's kind of a practical question, and I totally understand if you don't want to answer this. I imagine that there are plenty of details about your time over these years that you don't want to publicize, but this is obviously a cash business. Nobody's swiping any credit cards. There's no receipts. What do you do with all the money?
You rent an apartment to put it in. I had a right-hand guy, Cody Bates, his name was, and when I was living in the $1 million house on the mountain in Tucson, Cody had rented an apartment for himself, he'd rented an apartment for the money, he'd rented an apartment for the drugs. So he would go out and he would drop drugs off, wouldn't have money with him. He would separately collect the money, never have drugs and money together or guns because you're going to aggravate your charges. And then he would drop it into the apartment that we rented for the money. Wow.
But, I mean, you never attempted to launder it through banks or anything like that? Tried to...
Yeah, I did. I flew people over from the UK. I put money in their names. And the police were one step ahead of me. They put a virus in my computer called a NetBus Trojan Horse. And when I got arrested, they confiscated all of my assets. But the thing was, I had most of my money in the stock market. And if you remember, the stock market crashed 2000, 2001.
Sure, yeah.
So I was just down to six figures anyway by then. And I'd quit the ecstasy business as well.
All right. Shaun Attwood, former ecstasy kingpin, did hard time. That's the title of one of his books, actually, that I was reading up until late hours of last night. My name is Steve Warner, and the show is called Dark City. We'll be back in a minute. This is a hell of a story. It's on the Dark Matter Digital Network.
4, 3, 2, 1. WABC. You're listening to Dark City on the Dark Matter Radio Network. On demand at darkcity.fm.
All right, welcome back. Shaun Attwood continues with us. When you finally got busted in Tucson, how long had you been out of the game for?
Okay, I ended up getting busted in Scottsdale.
Okay.
I'd met a woman who was not into the rave scene, and she mocked me for being a raver. And she said, this is dangerous. She put me in danger. And in the end, I thought it would be the right thing to stop it. I'd done it for so long, I got away with it. And just, count your blessings and get on with your life. So I was then back to stock trading online, and had also enrolled in Scottsdale Community College. But it was May 16th, 2002, then the SWAT team came and smashed our door down.
And what, oh my God, can you describe that scene? I mean, for anybody, that's an unpleasant morning.
Well, I was on my computer watching the stock market very early, like 6 or 7 in the morning, and then there's a knock on the door. Bang, 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 bang. I jump up, look through the peephole, it's blacked out. So I'm thinking it could be cops, it could be someone who thinks I've got money in here because I was dealing ecstasy. I'm not sure what it is. So I start running through the living room, look through the window, police cars, marksmen. I can hear boots coming up the stairs, thud, 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 outside the apartment. I go back to the bedroom, get my girlfriend. I'm like, what should we do? What should we do? All right, we best let them in. Get halfway through the living room, boom! The door just flies off the hinges. Hands above your head, don't move, get on the ground now. So we just fell down. All those guns opened up in front of us. I just thought I was going to get shot at any second. My life's over. So then they crush you, handcuff you, and then they just yank me up. And the detective, my nemesis, it's the first time I've met him, and he was like, you're a big name from the rave scene. We're sure this raid is going to justify our charges. I think they thought I'd gone from dealing, not stopping dealing, but gone to become an even bigger dealer. And they thought the apartment was going to be full with loads of drugs. They tore the place apart, and they were really disappointed when they didn't find anything.
And you thought that they couldn't possibly charge you with anything because there were no drugs in your apartment. There was no cash in your apartment. What happened then when they took you down to, well, they didn't take you to the police station, did they? They took you to some processing center?
Originally, I was taken to Tempe Police Station, and they did a little bit of processing there. Okay. And then I was transferred over in the evening to Sheriff Joe Arpaio's infamous jail system, the Maricopa County jail system. And that was, the Horseshoe was what I went through. It took about 2 or 3 days to go through this formation of cells where all the new arrestees are in there, fights are breaking out, people are puking, people are coming down off drugs, guards are dragging people out and fastening them in these medieval torture devices called restraint chairs, putting hoods over their heads. It was a completely different world.
Yeah, and you didn't even know, they gave you the sheet of what your charges were, and you had transcribed it in your book. I couldn't, all I saw, it was some sort of like head of criminal enterprise, and I couldn't understand what the rest was, but they were holding you on $750,000 bond, cash only, which everybody thought had to be a mistake, right? But
yeah. No drugs are found. How can the bond be this big? I was thinking. But that charge sheet, I didn't understand it. So once I got through the horseshoe and I got to Towers Jail, first thing that happens for the new arrestees is, whatever race you are, the gang members come up to you. So the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang come up to me right away. What are your charges? And I'm like, I don't know what my charges are. I don't understand them. What do you mean you don't know what your charges are? Are you a chomo? So I'm getting more and more confused. I don't know what a chomo is either. That's a child molester. In the end, they're about to smash me. They got me up against the wall. I pulled my charge sheet out, and they read my charge sheet. And then they saw the bond was $750,000, and that, they saw I was in for drug charges, which nearly everybody is. And that's when they let me go. So, but certain crimes I kill on sight right away. Pedophiles, things like drive-by shootings where women and kids get hit, you're going to get beaten up right away as soon as you come in. And that's called convict justice. And they're looking for people to beat up because that's how they earn their tattoos. It's a whole system based on the more violent acts they commit, the higher up in the gang are the tattoos that they get awarded.
I didn't realize just how racially segregated it is. And this was not initially federal prison, right? This is just Maricopa County.
Yeah, I didn't do any federal time at all. It was all state time.
Wow. I mean, I can't believe how bad it was just at the county level. And was it in just the first couple of days, you saw somebody who was suspected of being a child molester, you saw him get stomped pretty good. Did he die? Was he put in? It sounded like, based on your description, that I don't know how anybody could survive what they were doing to him.
Well, what happened was the gang smashed this guy in the shower. It was a white-on-white thing. And then as the gang came out, this big white guy with cobwebs tattooed on his neck said, "How can we still hear him?" And he's all, "Oh, we smashed him good, dog." He's like, "Oh, not good enough." And the guy was whimpering in a pool of blood at that point. And then this big guy just goes in all casually, and it's just like crack, 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 like he's trying to break this guy's skull open, like it's a coconut. And he did that until the guy looked dead. Now, I've never seen violence at this level before, and I'm in shock. And the body's just laying there. A guard comes in, because they do security walks every 30 minutes, sees the guy, yells, "Lock down, everybody, lock down, go back to your cells." So I go back to my cell, put my head against the window, because I want to see what the damage is on this guy when they're taking him out on a stretcher. And he looks dead, and there's not just blood coming out of his head, there's yellow fluid, like brain stuff.
Oh,
and people say to me, how can this be allowed to happen? America champions human rights and all that kind of stuff. And I say, well, if you don't believe it, just go to my YouTube channel, Shaun Attwood, and I've got videos on there of not just gang members murdering the prisoners, but even the guards murdering the prisoners. And it's not big bad gang members who are getting murdered. It's mentally ill people. The guards even murdered the blind guy who was in there for shoplifting, Brian Crenshaw. And the guards that were found guilty in court for murdering these prisoners, the boss of the jail, Sheriff Joe Arpaio, afterwards actually gave some of them promotions and pay rises.
Oh, my God.
Yep.
Oh, my God. The corruption of this jail, you were luckily able to expose. You were writing a blog. From jail, you weren't writing it, on a computer there. You were smuggling notes out. Do you want to talk about basically the beginnings of this jail blog?
Yeah, what happened was, prior to my arrest, I thought prisoners, lock them up and throw away the key. It's paedophiles, serial killers, murderers, violent criminals. That's what the media led me to believe, and they also led me to believe it was all prisons were like holiday camps and there was gourmet food. Once I got in there...
You didn't, Shaun, really?
Well, in the UK, that's what, when I was growing up, that's what they lead you to believe. I hadn't paid that much close attention to it in America. I'd seen the sheriff doing publicity stunts and stuff like that. But once I got in there, and it's the warehousing of non-violent drug offenders, basically. A lot of these people were thrown away as kids, traumatized, sexually abused, seen their parents murdered, some of them, or had really bad, horrific experiences. I'm not making excuses for the crimes, but they were doing drugs to deal with that pain. About a third of them couldn't read or write, and hearing all the sad stories and knowing I had all the advantages in life that these guys didn't have made me feel like the biggest idiot in the world, and my heart opened hearing these sad stories, and I thought, okay, what can I do? I can start helping them with their legal paperwork. I can start teaching a class for the Mexicans so they can write home to their loved ones in Spanish because they couldn't read or write. And then I thought, what can I do on a bigger scale? Perhaps if I can expose what's going on in here, the conditions will get changed, and maybe it would save some lives. Maybe people wouldn't have to go through a lot of the things that they were going through, because they are unsentenced. There's supposed to be a presumption of innocence in that jail, yet they're getting treated worse than the sentenced prisoners in the Arizona Department of Corrections. So with a tiny pencil, like a golf pencil, sharpened against the door, I started to write everything down. And my aunt, she would visit me in maximum security. I hid what I wrote in legal paperwork and letters I could release to my aunt, because you weren't allowed to, I couldn't mail the things out because the guards can open your mail. So I hid that stuff, took it to the visitation officer. He's searching through it. My heart's going like crazy thinking he's going to find it. But they're trained to look for contraband, drugs, cash, syringes, stuff like that. So he put it on his table. I was in maximum security. I'm handcuffed to a table with a phone on one hand and my aunt's on the other side of the plexiglass. Once the visit's over, the guard handed that stuff to my aunt, and she went home, typed it up, emailed them to my parents in the UK, and that's how the blog John's Jail Journal started. They put it as John, Jon, so that people wouldn't know that it was me.
And do you suspect, I imagine you'd have to, that this is going on, that this is not isolated to the Maricopa County prison? This has got to be going on plenty of other places too, and it's just not able to be publicized. I mean, you can't have a Shaun Attwood at every one of these prisons. You can't have a whistleblower who's able to get all of this information out. And even if you could, who's going to believe some tweaker, right?
Exactly. There was all this outcry over the torture at Gitmo. Yeah, the stuff that's been going on in there has been going on in these county jails all over America for decades. Now, if you're a black guy, or if you're a Latino, you're 3 to 4 times more likely to be arrested for drugs. And the racism is just part of the system as well. These guys just get brutalized. The police know they've not got much money. They can't get lawyers. They can give them really long sentences. And there's all these contractors and private prison businesses just making money off the back of it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's money to be made every step of the way. The war on drugs, and we can speak later on about, my producer had mentioned something that you're currently working on that, made my eyes kind of widen when I got the email. Not all that surprising, but, anyway, you mentioned that people were sitting there unsentenced. You were unsentenced for 2 years. How? Walk me through that whole legal process.
Okay, the prosecutor is like a used car salesperson. So what they do is they come at you with a massive sentence in the beginning. And my massive sentence was, they said up to 200 years. And I saw one guy get 200 years for drugs. I saw people get decades of drugs. They said, if you go to trial and lose, you've got 20-plus charges. Each charge carries 5 to 10 years. We'll give you the aggravated maximum and stack all those charges. So basically, over time, they then start to come down. That's where the used car salesman part comes in. And they know in the meantime the conditions are so brutal in the jail, it's breaking you down psychologically so that in the end you will agree to a lesser sentence. So I was the last man standing in my case. I fought the case for 26 months. In the end, I signed for 9.5 years. And the bottom line is, your sentence length is determined by how much money you've got and who your lawyer is. And I had Alan Simpson, a really good lawyer, and my parents came up with almost $100,000 to pay him. And that's why at the end of the day, I got that 9.5 year sentence. And as a first-time non-violent drug offender, I only ended up serving just under 6.
Yeah, it's incredible. What were you? You've been banned from the United States for the rest of your life, but you definitely got off easy considering you were looking at 200 years. What were your actual charges that were basically unreadable on that sheet? They were accusing you of being head of a criminal enterprise, and what were the other charges?
Yeah, my main charge was conspiracy. So basically, everybody they arrested in my case was a spoke on my wheel, even if I didn't know them, and I didn't know a lot of them. So all their crimes then, I had to take responsibility for. And all the people they'd arrested, they'd been dealing drugs since I'd actually quit. So they weren't getting their drugs from me. So all the phone calls that showed the suppliers, they kept those out of the loop. But, I don't want to sound like I'm whining here for getting caught. I take full responsibility for what I did. And I needed to be arrested, and I credit it with saving my life and sending my life in this whole new positive direction now. So, and even though the conditions were really brutal and it pushed me to the brink of suicidal insanity, it was the force needed upon my ego and upon my person necessary to crush that old English Shaun wild character out of me. My first year in the jail, I was pining for my old lifestyle back. I was resenting getting caught. There was no evidence against me, really. No physical evidence. It was just hearsay. And there was a turning point in the second year where, I started to take responsibility for it. I saw the harm that drugs caused because 90% of the guys in the jail were shooting up heroin and crystal meth. They were at the end of the road of drug use. 2/3 had hepatitis C, which was slowly killing them, and the jail wouldn't pay for the treatment. So I said to myself, you started on this road of drug use over here where you thought it was fun, it was cool. The SWAT team came, they took you off that road halfway down it. These guys are at the end of that road. Think about all the people you put on that road and how possibly bad things could have happened to them. So that was my wake-up call, to see that I needed to take responsibility for what I'd done. And all I could do then was say, look, I can't change my past. That's crushed out of me now. I can just pledge to do positive things in the future. And that's why I go across the UK now speaking to schools in the hope they won't make my mistakes.
The people that you saw in the Maricopa County Jail who had suffered the effects of drug abuse, was that the first time you had really seen up close those effects? I mean, had you encountered anybody? Look, MDMA specifically, there was a Peter Jennings documentary that was ABC News 10 or 12 years ago or so. It was called Ecstasy Rising. And they estimated in New York City, out of 111 million doses taken in a given year, they could attribute like two or maybe 3 deaths to MDMA. So my point is, there are prescription drugs that are potentially more dangerous than MDMA. Now, obviously, ecstasy, there can be other things in there. You don't know really what you're getting, but did you have moments during your, I guess, dealing days when you saw firsthand the effects of any of the drugs that you were selling?
No, I really didn't, and that might have woke me up earlier because, I just looked at it as I was continuing the party for everybody. Now, what I was aware of was the possibility of people getting sick or dying from the ecstasy. So what I did was, there was a website called Dance Safe, and they actually sold testing kits. So when my guys would go to Holland to buy the ecstasy, they would take these testing kits with them from Dance Safe, they test the pills. If it's 125 milligrams of pure MDMA and clay, the color would come up like purple or something like that on this testing kit. So I knew then, the pills were safe and no one was going to die, and nothing like that ever happened as far as I'm aware on my pills. So I wasn't, you are right, ecstasy is comparative to other things out there. It is very safe. A minority of people die from dehydration or if they've got certain conditions. And it's because of the war on drugs that now the chemicals to make pure MDMA, they've been clamped down on by the authorities. So you've got all these fake pills. Here in the UK, dozens of young people have died this year because of the fake pills and the ingredients like PMA that they're putting in them. And that's a direct consequence of the war on drugs.
Yeah. I mean, there was a statistic that I read recently. The DEA claims that out of however many pills that they tested in the last year or two, the vast majority of them, it was well over 3/4 of these pills that they tested, contained no MDMA at all. So if you're thinking that you can buy Molly or ecstasy in New York City and it's going to be great, chances are it's not. Chances are you're going to have a problem with it. You have no idea where these pills come from. And yeah, I guess I would have to completely agree with you. It's a direct consequence of the war on drugs, which, as far as I can tell, and it sounds like you're saying the same thing, that this is just this money-making scam every single step of the way. You've got the prosecutors who are getting paid, the judges, the prison for-profit system, which is exactly what it is, the prison for-profit system, I would call it. But there's other people making money off of this too, and this is something that, I guess it's what you're working on now. We'll come back with Shaun Attwood in a minute. The show is called Dark City on the Dark Matter Digital Network.
WABC, New York.
All right, we are back with Shaun Attwood. The real high-level stuff. It's not necessarily the Mexican cartels. It's not necessarily guys who are pressing pills in Holland. It's even higher than that. And I have very limited information on this, but my producer sent me an email saying that you are working on, or at least in your research, you came up against information that suggests that the CIA is heavily involved in drug running.
Absolutely. Once I looked at this in depth, and you see that the DEA and the FBI, they go up the ladder of these drug dealing organizations, but once they get to the top and try and make these arrests, the CIA comes in and says, no way, national security interest, you can't touch that guy. And, if you watch that movie, Kill the Messenger, about Gary Webb,
I haven't seen that yet.
That's a classic example of how the CIA facilitates the mass distribution of drugs around the world. They work with criminal organizations, they work with mafias, and there's always fall guys ready, levels and front companies in case anything goes wrong. But every now and then it spills over and it gets exposed, and that's what Gary Webb did. He exposed it.
There's a movie that I just saw in last week. It's called Sicario. It's with Emily Blunt, Benicio del Toro. And there is a scene in that movie where somebody mentions the word Medellin. And they were not referring to the Medellin cartel. They were not referring to Medellin, Colombia. The word specifically referred to a time when it sounded like the CIA ran things. And the idea was to provide a measure of stability. If you control it top down, you can, as I say, provide that stability. Now it seems like it's very fractured. You've got the cartels, Mexican cartels, who are just sort of wreaking havoc, not only on Mexico, but it is creeping over the border. Can I ask just what materials that you stumbled upon or found that support what you're saying, the CIA drug running? Obviously, Gary Webb, amazing investigative journalist who sort of broke this back in the 80s or early 90s, I think it was.
Well, if anyone's interested in this, I would suggest they read books like Whiteout, The Big White Lie, The Politics of Heroin, or Compromised by Terry Reid. Because Gary Webb, he was really looking into it from the outside. But the books I've just quoted, they rely heavily on people who've worked for the DEA, people who've worked for the CIA, pilots of these cocaine shipments that were being brought into the USA, pilots, people like Bo Abbott, Terry Reid, Chip Tatum. They've all got their testimonies on YouTube. You can watch those videos and they'll describe in detail exactly what they did working for the CIA.
And is this part of the next book that you're writing?
Yeah, I'm writing a book called We Are Being Lied To, and the subtitle is The War on Drugs and the Prison Industrial Complex. And, as I've researched this more and more and more, all avenues end up going up to the CIA. And it goes right back even to, have you heard of Klaus, the Butcher of Lyon, the Nazi? He was one of the guys who, when the arrests were made at the end of World War II, went to work for the organization that came before the CIA, and then he ended up in Bolivia, and he became part of the Bolivian government there, helping with the death squads. But his most lucrative thing was getting into the international distribution of the cocaine paste. This was before Pablo Escobar even. And the CIA, financed a lot of the stuff that he was doing. And then along comes Pablo Escobar. His mistake was he wasn't buying arms from the U.S. Manufacturers and working with the CIA. That's why they took him out in the end. Because they, at the same time, the CIA was financing organizations that were in competition with him. And this pattern just goes on and on and on, whereby weapons are sent out of America, and drugs are brought in, and the money's laundered through the big banks.
Yeah, there was an investigative journalist that I spoke to in the last year. His name is Dan Hopsiker, and he told me that this is something that the CIA will never give up because it's just so profitable. And also, it's that other angle that occurred to me, and I'm sure it's true. It's just a movie, but it sounded very plausible, that idea that they control everything. It's that measure of control that they can exert, and I imagine that the Mexican cartels really are presenting a big problem for them. How do you keep up on those developments at all? You've got El Chapo now, who is on the run, the second in command. Just a little aside, the second in command at the DEA, he was all set to retire, and he did an interview, I think it was Time Magazine, and he said, I was all set to retire, and then this dick had to go and escape. So he is now...
I was being contacted by people, associates of the Mexican cartel, after I got released and I was over in the UK, and they wanted me to establish a network out here for them to distribute cocaine. I said, look, my crimes are all in the past now. I'm legit. I don't want to get involved in anything like that. From meeting these guys, though, I would say this: the Mexican government, the police, and the cartels are all one and the same. There's different cartels rivaling each other. But for example, say the cartel wants to get the latest in American weapons and training, they send over people who are police or Mexican military to America to get all that training. They come back with the latest weapons and become death squads for the cartel.
Wow.
So you can't separate them. They're all working together, but there's different cartels rivaling each other.
Yeah, this El Chapo character, he apparently traveled throughout Mexico really with impunity, with based on the information that I've read, basically with protection from federal police. His kids are actually very active on social media. They post pictures of, their pet tigers, and their one kid posted a picture from his Rolls Royce, a picture of the federal police truck acting as an escort. I mean, just posting it on social media, just saying, yeah, this is what's going on. I mean, they are one and the same. The federal police, the cartels. It's just corruption doesn't even begin to describe it.
And again, this is all a function of the war on drugs. We've seen 100,000 people die in Mexico in the last 5 years. And if these drugs were worthless, if they were legal, they would be worthless. But because they're illegal, the price shot up and gave them this value. So now you've got all these criminal organizations scrambling to control those markets and taking each other out.
Mm. Yeah, well, where do you see it headed? I mean, and first of all, what effect do you think it's had? So much of this legalization of marijuana, it happened in Colorado, it happened in Vermont, now in New York, actually, under a certain amount, it's, I think you might get a ticket or something. It's not considered criminal possession anymore. Do you think that's a step in the right direction to legalize all drugs? Do you think that all drugs should be legalized?
Absolutely. Just give you some background on that. Since Nixon kicked off the war on drugs, the U.S. has spent over $1 trillion arresting 50 million people, the majority of whom were potheads that weren't dealers. Mm-hmm. Now, it peaked in 2008. We had 872,000 people arrested for weed.
Wow. Since
the states have started to legalize or decriminalize, in 2013 that went down to 693,000. It went from 52% of drug arrests in 2008 to 40.6% in 2013. So I think that's a really good thing, because when you've got 1 in 100 adults in prison, when everyone in America knows someone, has a family member or a friend in prison because of drugs, you're going to get a backlash. Parents are sick of their kids getting busted. There's kids out there that have been busted with weed in their parents' cars, and under civil asset forfeiture laws, the police have confiscated the parents' cars and they've not been able to get them back. So it's got so out of control over this war on drugs, which is really a war on people smoking pot, that there's been this backlash. I think that's a very sensible direction for the country to be going in. But look at Obama. He's got marijuana classified as a Schedule I drug, as harmful as heroin and more harmful than cocaine. And even though he's gone and visited a prison and reduced a handful of sentences for some guys, if you look at the graph of drug arrests and the prison population, it did go up, continued to go up during most of his presidency. And he's actually put a massive amount of money into raiding federal funds for raiding medicinal marijuana places. So it's all smoke and mirrors with him too.
When you mentioned civil asset forfeiture, there are some states that are especially notorious for that. I think Tennessee is one. I think actually Arizona is another big one. But there are people who are pulled over. The highway patrols love this civil asset forfeiture, because they can pull people over, usually from out of state, and if they search the car, if they find cash, they love it, because they get to keep it, and they get to keep the vast majority of what they confiscate, and it goes into their toy fund, basically. You know, they'll buy some new armored truck, they'll buy, you know, brand new submachine guns, you know, just because. But it does all feed into this idea, more than an idea. I mean, this is just fact. The fact that the government, not only on the federal level, but really on the local level, people are just making money off of this every step of the way. The judges, the prosecutors, the prisons, the guards, the lawyers. I mean, legalizing marijuana might be a step in the right direction, but I don't see cocaine and any other drug really being legalized anytime soon, because there's just too much money to be made off of it. You legalize everything, and you know, how do you tax it? It's just it would be more of a logistical nightmare, I think, to try to tax all of it than just to do what they're doing now. They have all the infrastructure in place now to do what they're currently doing, and it's a, you know, billion, if not $1 trillion industry.
Well, the people who put the best case forward for legalizing everything are the police. And I'm talking about law enforcement against prohibition. They've got some excellent videos on YouTube. And they say, you know, the police was started by Robert Peel in London to stop people from hurting each other. Robbers, murderers, rapists, paedophiles. If you go back thousands of years, that's been the case. People have needed to be protected from each other. But what happened was, drug laws came about in the last century, and mostly they were arresting people for possession, and they were people who were just hurting themselves. So you got all these police resources now on the warehousing of all these non-violent drug offenders, and the rate at which murders were being solved and all these other crimes has gone down because the police times all took up with non-violent drug offenders. Just absolute disaster for the taxpayers. But once you start looking at the war on drugs, not as a government policy, as a business model, then it all makes sense. Because the prison industry, like you said, makes money off locking the people up. CIA can make money off facilitating the drug transactions. The banks make money from the laundering of the drugs. Certain industries are protected. For example, plastics, big pharma. You know, these are all the guys putting money up to keep weed from being legalized, because they know that it could be turned into an industrial crop which would compete with modern medication.
Yeah, I was reading recently about the decriminalization of a lot of drugs in Portugal. Maybe it was all drugs, but it's certainly a lot. And apparently, after legalization, there was really no adverse effect on drug usage rates. It's not like they legalized everything and just all of a sudden people are shooting up in the streets, you know, tenfold more than they were previously. So I think the argument that, hey, you legalize it and, you know, it's just going to be drugs on every street corner and, you know, people passed out everywhere and doped up out of their minds. Look, drugs are easy enough to get as it is, but the fact that most people are not doing them probably would be a strong indication that most people just don't have the interest.
Teenagers in America are saying it's easier for them to get heroin than it is alcohol. And that's because the criminal gangs will send people in the schools to sell it. If the government regulated it and taxed it and kept it away from the kids, it would be a far safer way to handle the situation. And also the drugs then wouldn't be getting diluted with these toxic substances and causing all these deaths. Wherever drugs have been legalized, the police beforehand have said, oh no, we can't do that. Drug use will surge, crime will go out of control, there'll be addicts rolling around on the streets. And everywhere you look around the world where it's happened, the complete opposite has been the result. In my hometown of Widnes, in the early 1990s, they actually started a project where they gave free heroin to the users. They wanted to see what would happen. Crime collapsed. Wow. They weren't out robbing the shops. The shopkeepers were like, yeah, you got to keep this going. People weren't getting robbed on the streets. People's houses weren't getting burgled. Because they had clean needles, they weren't spreading AIDS to each other. Diseases went down. And it was about to get rolled out across the entire country. And it was picking up news headlines around the world. And what happened was the American federal government found out about it. They contacted the UK government, and the UK government shut it down. And eventually, the Portuguese found out about it, and they picked it up from there, and their program has been incredibly successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, when you mention heroin use, I mean, heroin has gotten unbelievably cheap, as I understand it. The town that I grew up in New Jersey, apparently has developed a bit of a heroin problem, and this is a nice suburb in New Jersey. When I was growing up, you could get weed, and that was it. And now you've got one of the most, and who knows what else is in there? Who knows who is really selling it? Who knows if it's? I mean, it is scary to see that criminal element invading small town America. Same thing is happening in Vermont. Apparently, it's way worse in Vermont. I think Burlington is the city that it's really, terrorized, I guess is the right word.
Because drugs are illegal, the criminal elements manufacture the highest concentrations possible so they get the most bang for the bucks. If you look at prohibition of alcohol in the last century in the U.S., people were going out drinking beer, and then along came prohibition, and that caused the mafia to mass produce the highest concentrate of liquor. And that's when the alcoholism and the crime and everything else got out of control. And it's the same with drugs. People say, weed is sending all these people to the funny farm and stuff like that, but it's because it's been grown now in such a high concentration, the skunk and these other forms of it, that's causing the most damage to people psychologically. So again, I believe in all drugs should be legalized completely because it would end all of these problems that it's caused.
All right, we're talking to Shaun Attwood, a former drug kingpin turned advocate for prisoners' rights, basically, and gives talks at schools around the UK. We'll come back in a minute on Dark City on the Dark Matter Digital Network.
To Dark City on the Dark Matter Radio Network. On demand at darkcity.fm.
All right, Shaun, when you were in prison, this is something that you had mentioned, you used to listen to Art Bell at night.
Yeah, that was part of my awakening to what's really going on in the world, especially in the political arena.
Who did you... So are there any classic shows that stand out to you? Because Art is probably listening to this right now. This is actually the lead-in to Art's show, Midnight in the Desert.
I listen to Coast, and I can't remember if it was Art Bell specifically, but I do remember listening to people like David Icke, Michael Rupert, people that were giving their talks on like geopolitics. They had some Russian authors on there, and when I go through my letters that I wrote home to my parents, I read all these little notes. I was listening to Art Bell last night, listening to George Norrie, I think the other guy's name was, and I was describing about. And then I'd request my parents to send me books from the authors that I've been hearing about on Coast to Coast.
Oh, that's funny.
And then that just it was like a spider's web then. It just expanded from there. I pledged to read as many books as possible and to turn incarceration into the education opportunity of a lifetime. I ended up reading over 1,000 books in just under 6 years.
That's incredible.
In 2006, I read 268 books alone.
That's incredible. The other guy, I think, is Dave Norrie. But
Dave Norrie, okay.
Yeah. Well, Midnight in the Desert is starting in a minute. Do you want to introduce the show? I'm serious.
What's it called again? Sorry.
It's called Midnight in the Desert. You just want to say, I'm Shaun Attwood. I used to listen to Art in jail. Anything else you want to say? Art's probably listening right now. Everybody's listening. Go for it.
Okay, this is Shaun Attwood of National Geographic Channel's Locked Up Abroad. I used to listen to Art Bell in jail, the toughest jail in Arizona, and it really helped me learn a lot about how the world really works. So here we are with Art Bell coming on next.
Beautiful. Shaun, thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you, Steve.